Alright, this is just a video to kind of give you guys both kind of like a top level strategy about how to approach modeling the delta shelter by Olson Kundig, which is the assignment for this week, right? This is the sort of screen capture from the model. This is the view of the actual building. And you'll see that like there are certain small details that I just kind of skipped out on for now, but I think most of it is kind of there, okay? So obviously you need to spend some time familiarizing yourself with the project, and the basic understanding is really actually just like the fact that it's mostly square with a kind of fireplace, volume that's jutting out, okay? And everything else is sort of exterior balcony or stairs, walkways, 3 sort of levels. There's this sort of storage room on the bottom. And even that is kind of cantilevered out, or like it's not actually really touching the ground. You can kind of see here, right? So these footings, the 4 corner pillars are actually one of the things that kind of runs through the entire project, right? So that's actually a pretty good place to start. And so I'll kind of run you through some of these phases, starting out with just like kind of getting all the images in, the reference material in, okay? And you'll see that we're doing the same thing we did with the scaling, just kind of using that as as a way to scale everything down. And this is typically what I do. And this is actually using the picture command. And so just make sure that your units are appropriate. So this is in this case, this should be a feet. I like to use decimal, but you can use feet and inches if you like. Doesn't really matter. Make sure it's in feet. And here I'm actually just using the picture command to bring in all of these things. So I'm going to go to the folder with all these photos, okay? And I would start with one of the plans, right? And you'll see that like this gets faster as you kind of get a sense of like how big something should be. When you plop it in, it should just give you the proportional size and everything, okay? And first thing you should do is basically draw a 30 feet segment, right? And I always use these sort of end crooks just so I can kind of see it better, right? The nice thing about this is obviously the sort of picture command does it on a surface. Eventually you should assign these to its own layer, and you can actually kind of do something like this by just zooming in, clicking on that point and snapping it to this corner. And now we know, okay, now this image has to shrink down, right? This is the 30 feet actual distance. So we'll scale using this as the base point, right? Going all the way down. Make sure your kind of ortho or your smart track is on like this, so it kind of does snap it to the right locations. Do that, click here, and just shrink it down, match it to this point. So we know that, okay, this is, this scale for this is correct, right? Now do the same, you kind of just do the same for, all the other images. Once you've done it once, you'll kind of get a better sense of the scale anyways, and you can just like copy this one over and you kind of go through the same thing. So it gets really quick once you get used to it. And there you go. So these two sort of plans are roughly the same scale. Now, one thing you also notice is like, for example, and you can kind of see this here, like actually probably most of these elevations are the same scale. So what you'll find is that once you've done one of them, so here I'm going to do this elevation, for example, plop it in, okay, copy this over. So do that, okay. So I need to scale it up a little. So scale, click here, click on the scale here, and then just bring it up, right? So we know, okay, this is roughly the right scale. Once you've done one, those are actually all kind of very similar in size. So my guess is that they are the same scale. So you can kind of do this, right? Third one, just kind of stack them and just snap to the corners of the image. Fourth one, stack them to the corner of the image. And these scales should actually be very close, if not identical, okay? And then, you know, it's actually the same thing for the sections, right? These guys as well. The sections, maybe you'll have to kind of check and see, might be slightly different, but, you know, you can always double check and just adjust if they're off. I think you'll see that some of them might be off by a little, right? So, okay, that one is off by a little, so just scale that down, right? So you know that it's, you know, actually correct. Okay, so this is a process of just like kind of importing and getting all the images in and scaling them properly. All right, now the next step I do as part of this is the second step, is that I start kind of tracing some elements in the floor plan. So this is, you know, the walls, some of the major kind of parts, right? Ignoring the furniture for now, the outline of the floor plan. One thing to keep in note is that actually I'm doing the sort of fireplace part sort of on its own, just because it's something that juts out into more of a mass than anything, right? So you can start doing that, trace, you know, the sort of I-beams, columns that are in here as well. Keeping in mind that like I try to actually keep the dimension of these actually pretty much the same, right? Because they're actually meant to be the same size. So do kind of rationalize these as you're going along, so that the distances for these things are, you know, 0.36, right? This is 10.5 feet, right? Like they're not like random dimensions. Otherwise, further down the line, you're going to have a lot of trouble kind of getting everything to line up because if your dimensions are all over the place. This like overall is something like 20 feet or something close to, right? So 20 by 20 square is probably roughly where this should kind of end up, okay? So try to rationalize the dimensions, understand like, okay, a lot of these things eventually have to match up like very closely, right? Same for here. You can end up with the stairs for now. I would probably kind of do these like balcony portions as separately. So you'll see I have a curve that's just like kind of for the floor slab, okay? And that's kind of, you know, how you would start. You can do the sort of inner partition walls just the same way you did those in the Ondo project. Now you will see, and you can kind of take a look at these. Essentially, I've kind of arranged all the drawings relative to what they should be like, right? So this elevation, that elevation, this elevation is matching each side of the floor plan. So these are kind of turned 180 degrees. The section is aligned in the right sort of location. And this is lower floor, that's the third floor, this is the second floor, right? It just kind of helps me understand what's going on as well. And also one thing I sometimes do, so you can kind of just like draw, right, these sort of registration lines, just kind of say, okay, well, this is aligning with the side of the building, right? These are all things you can do to help you kind of line these things up, right, like that, and in different directions as well. So these are all lined up, right? So the edges of the chimney sort of mass, right, all make sense, okay? Now you might ask, oh, how do I get these so small? Just remember that the picture command, when you use it, to go find it again, when you use it and you bring something in like this, you can always just trim it, okay? So let's say I was trying to cut it down, right, so it didn't have that much white space around it. I can just simply draw a rectangle around this, getting pretty close to it, right? Leave a little bit on the bottom, right? If I know the scale is correct, obviously. Just select this curve, right, and use the trim command, trim. Just trim out the rest. You can delete the curve right away, and you're just kind of left with that section of the drawing that you need. Okay, so that's how I sort of get to this. Okay, so next sort of phase. Now, this phase might be somewhat of a jump for you, but essentially, let me kind of close down some other stuff. Essentially, what I did, or what you should start to kind of do, this little one doesn't exist, is, you know, using some of those like initial tracings that you did of the first sort of floor slab in particular, is actually to try to get things into the right place for the floor slab. I'm actually not sure what this thing is. I'll have to double check that. So there are sort of concrete footings here, and you can measure them basically by, and this is why, you know, kind of having these turning with the right direction sometimes will help. And you can kind of find the concrete footing and you can kind of get a measure off of it. Oh, it's about 1 foot, right? And then, you know, 0.8 tall, right? So this gives you like direct measurements off of, you know, the drawings. If you find this kind of too unwieldy, you can always just kind of do a split screen like this. You can move your, you know, viewports around and do measurements off of some of these orthogonal views. So using the distance command and just like measure height, right? So you roughly know how much it should be, things like that, and come back here and model it, okay? So the concrete footings, one trick that may be useful for some people, depending, is that, like, for example, I actually have all my images locked on a layer, but let's say I free it up and I make a copy of this guy. So copy up to here, okay? And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to draw a line and trim it pretty much exactly at the ground plane, so somewhere around here, okay? Draw a line there, right? Use this, might nudge it down just a little bit, okay? Use this to trim off the ends of it. Delete this, okay? And so this thing, I will actually just rotate so it stands up, and then move vertical, so M, spacebar, V, spacebar, okay? Move vertical and just snap it to here. And essentially that's like what it should match to in elevation, right? So you can do it with any number of these. You can put in a section if you want, you know, it's sort of up to you. Just make sure it's on its own layer so you can kind of close or hide it pretty easily. But what this gives you is actually a pretty good visual reference of like where your floor slab should be, right, relative to everything else, right? And so these should line up. Of course, you can kind of measure, right? But, you know, this is just to kind of help you figure things out. And this step is usually pretty helpful or useful to have in there. But, you know, you can always just kind of measure from the bottom to the top to know, okay, this is how high that floor slab is, you know, to kind of get your intervals correct, right? So this is something I just like hide and then show when I need it, right? So that's just kind of like how that works. Actually, I think I had the previous one in there as well. Okay, so first sort of order of business, really just kind of get the sort of, you know, outline of the floor slab in place, get these guys in there, the sort of footings, right? You'll see the steel, sort of 4 steel columns are embedded in there. So essentially you just kind of zoom in and like trace one of the outlines. I think it's maybe in here somewhere. Zoom in and trace one of the I-beam or the column outlines sort of right here, right? This, you know, try to normalize it, and then, you know, if the 4 corners don't match perfectly, it's not, you know, not the end of the world. But I try to make sure that their distances and their intervals between the corners are like pretty close, right? And you'll see I just extruded tall enough to punch through the roof. We'll trim it later, right? So I'm not worried about it and kind of how it fits under the roof, right? Just like overshoot it, right? Okay, so once you kind of have that, you know, don't forget that there is this opening for the stair that kind of goes down this way. So this is the beginning of the stair, that's the end of the stair going up, right? So you'll have to kind of get some of that information from between the 2 floor plans, that one and this one. to kind of match it up, right? Because this actually is the stair opening and this is the floor, so the stair actually continues a couple more steps down. Okay, so you'll have to kind of match the floor plans to be able to understand when or where the stair actually starts and it ends up here, right? So that's how you, but this opening of the floor slab is just kind of like how it should be. All right. Okay, so here's the kind of trick that I kind of use to do these, right? This part, okay? And a big part of it comes from actually just kind of having the outline of your floor slabs, okay? So what I do here often is I will use the command duplicate face border, so dupe face border, and click on, a face, right? And what it gives me is this sort of outline, of that floor slab, just like that. Okay. Now you'll see I do a lot of modeling on the default layer, or I make a construction line layer, essentially, where I throw a lot of like kind of curved geometry that may or may not be useful afterwards, but I just keep it there just in case. Okay, and this is actually half of the I-beam, right? So let's say the sort of I-beam or I-column profile that we had earlier may have probably looked like something like that. I just kind of split it in half, right? So we're going to use this and use this to kind of do essentially the sort of I-beam profile that you see on the ends here, right, on each floor, right, as well as the photos themselves, right, basically the sort of flange of these I-beams, right. And what you do here is actually just like arrange it and put it together like this. So this side snaps to like one of the edges of this square, for example. Okay, this is the floor slab shape. All right, and essentially what we do here is a sweep one. So sweep one. Okay, it will ask you for a rail. So this is the rail. Cross section curves this. All right, and then just enter. And you don't have to modify this for the most part. Enter. You will see what it does is it takes that profile and kind of sweeps it around that sort of square shape. So you have these nice kind of thin bevel sort of flange edges. And then just take this and copy it over and place it in place. Now what it should be doing is a little something like this, right? So it's a little bit offset from your column, the main four sort of columns. You will not, and these should be identical, so they should match like above and below. And you can kind of do the same thing for these sort of balcony portions as well. In my case, I actually did this as one sweep, and I just added these segments in just to kind of complete the square. But I think the more logical way for you guys to do it is actually kind of do the squares and just add the sort of balcony portions on their own as like their own little pieces instead of one big sweep, right? So that's how you get that. This is actually, these are the chimneys that are coming from measuring that portion of the chimney and looking at it in plan. So you'll see the little circle that I used to try to get basically that it extruded from, right, to try to get the right, roughly the right diameter for the chimneys, and then I just measure the distance here from here, right, to get the right height. Okay, so that's kind of mostly that. I'll bring back, so there are a couple walls here, right? These are the walls that we just extruded from the floor plan, so these are kind of fairly self-explanatory. The trickier one is just this one, right? So this one actually, in the floor plan, I also actually just kind of like traced the shape that they had in the floor plan, like this, right? And when extruding it, I just extruded to the right height that I saw in the elevation. But you'll see that there's like sort of like a top-bottom part that actually is closed, right? I mean, the sort of fireplace doesn't like cover the entire thing, right? And so The sort of simple fix to this is actually just kind of use the box command, right, and then come down. And you'll kind of see it better in the interior of the project if you kind of go see here, right? And actually, I should actually seal off this as well. It's really just like this portion needs to be open, this portion needs to be open, this should actually be blocked off, right? It's not the entire wall of it, right? So, and you can kind of see that in the section too, right? So it's just that portion should be open, okay? So what you would want to do is like do this, right? Make a box and do a Boolean union, right? And particularly, you can kind of obviously dimension it properly, but essentially something like that, right? So you just have the sort of fireplace openings correct, and just take all of these together, Boolean union, okay? And then merge all faces. So same stuff you've been doing with Ondo. So you'll be left with like essentially what is correct and the fireplace holes in the right locations. Now do, of course, use the section drawing to help you kind of check these dimensions, but don't forget that you can always move by using the move face command, right? If you need to adjust it up and down, right, you can always do that after the fact. Okay, so that should cover the primary walls, right? I did kind of do the internal sort of partition walls as wood in a different color, right? You can come back and fill these in. These should actually just be doors. But you know, that's something actually that's a little bit secondary for the moment in this assignment. All right, so that's how that all kind of comes together, right? All right, so one big question you might have is actually these stairs, right? So like I said earlier, the way I typically deal with this, and you can kind of close things down so it's kind of less in the way, is that you've got to figure out the first line, which is like where the stair slope starts and then where it ends. So it's up there, right? So that's kind of its trajectory. And what I do is actually I draw kind of a line from one corner to this corner, right? I count the number of stairs that are in here. I believe it was 14 or 15, right? Take the line, just divide it. Let's see if 14 is correct. Yeah, so 14. Just run the divide command, do 14 segments. It'll give you kind of the locations of the treads, right? And then you can work your way backwards. And it's actually just kind of really simple, right? You can, and this is actually a thing I do all the time. So, you know, you can just actually like take this line, right? Use the extrude command. So my shortcut for my extrude is E. So it'll go up and down, right? But you can actually change the direction of the extrusion by giving it a base point and a direction. So just make sure direction is always kind of like orthogonal, and you can snap to that first point, which will then kind of give you the tread as a surface, right? This you can offset surface or extrude surface. Extrude surface, right? And I did, I think, 3/4 or 1 inch, basically, depending on what you want to do. So 0.75 inches to give it the thickness. Okay. This was not capped because I didn't pick the solid option, but you can always just cap it afterwards. No big deal, right? So now you have that, then you should also, I mean, this should actually be sunken, right? So the proper location of this is actually like this, right? So you have the location of your treads. This one might have been slightly different, but you know, you get the idea. So use those points to just like populate, you know, all the treads all the way up. Okay. Now for these, basically what you want to do is, and I'll delete this first one just so you guys can see the process, is so these are open sort of riser stairs, right? And they have the stringers on the side. Essentially what I do is actually use this command called the Doop Edge, duplicate edges, right? So I know it wants to run like this, and you can kind of go back to the photos of the project. You can kind of vaguely see it in some of the photos. here, right? For example, right? This is kind of what it looks like. Okay. It's actually in. You'll also see it a bit more vaguely, but it's there in one of the, yeah, here in this section, right? This is upside down, but that's the section. So I think I measured this off just to get a sense of like what that thickness should be. But with the Doop Edge command, what you do is actually just like basically get kind of the bottom edges of the tread. Okay, like that. All right, so you have that. Okay, I'm going to hide that wood layer so it's kind of less in the way, but you'll see now we have that. Okay, and these were kind of like the top of the tread, right? So if I'm going back and kind of measuring this, so distance, let's say from here to here, it looks roughly like, let's just call it like 1.2, right? So 1.2 feet. So I'll actually just take this, right, and copy or move it down. So negative 1.2. So that's the bottom, right? And all you need to do is actually just link these. So be careful that you're not kind of snapping to the wrong sort of place, right? And for some of you, I'm kind of used to this, doing this in sort of 3D, but if you're more comfortable trying to like get these, lay them flat, then you can do that flat as well and just like kind of move them back eventually. So last one, I'll do it like this. Okay. This overshoots, right? But because this is sort of at an edge, so you can actually use the floor slab to trim off this guy. And actually you can turn on ghosted. You'll see the line go through, but you can keep on trimming if you turn on ghosted mode, because the ghosted mode will use the second surface as well to trim, and this as well, right? There's a little bit there, so let's trim that again. So okay, not the biggest deal in the world, right? Now I want these actually to, I want this one to actually go up a step and then just like shoot out that way, okay? Because eventually we're going to join these. So I'm going to use the connect command to connect this curve to this. I guess it doesn't intersect. Okay. We extend. So I'm going to extend using this as a boundary object and see. This might actually be a tiny little, oh yeah, it's a tiny little bit off. Okay, so that was sort of my mess up while doing this in real time, but what you, to kind of fix this actually, sometimes what you can do is just select everything, right? Get everything. And it might be slightly off. It's slightly off if you're trying to fix it. This is what I would do, is actually just kind of move it out somewhere. Okay, somewhere flat, right? And zoom again, turn it 90 like this, and then project it to C plane. Yes. Okay, which will technically should flatten everything. We can take a look at this again, a bit more closer, right? See if this can trim that. Okay, so that does work. And then this, I think, was the end section, so this should be like that. Okay, and then just see if it can join. If it can join it, then you're probably in good shape. Now, I do this one by one specifically just because I want to make sure, you know, things actually join properly. You can kind of just like select everything and let it kind of auto join, but you know, sometimes if my ends are a little bit questionable, then I will check. Yeah, so like actually there's something not perfect here, and it is this end. You can kind of tell, right? So let's just explode that. Let me trim this off with that. Okay, so join this to this. Okay, so I mean, you've gone through this. If the dots are kind of annoying, then just use the selection filter. So this, select these, the dots, and just like delete them. Okay, and let's see if this joins properly. So that's one closed. This is the open curve. We can just delete that. And then this should, okay, should extrude. Okay, so once you've extruded this, you know, same thing, 0.75 or kind of inches or whatever. That's 3/4. It might be thicker than that in real life. I'm not sure because we can't really tell from the drawings. Okay, but move it back, right? And you can then actually just like be able to copy it back into place like that, roughly. Actually, let's turn on the stairs so I know. Okay, so this should actually be right at the front edge. And you can always sort of like reorient and just like, make sure you're snapping to the right places first. So like that should essentially kind of fit pretty well, right? And all I did was just kind of move it inboards, I think, a certain amount. So it was actually kind of supporting it like the treads on the other side. Just copy it over. All right, so, that's how you kind of do these inner stairs, right? So we've covered that, the walls, steel portions, right? So how to kind of do the edge beams, how to do these straight ones, okay? All right, so last thing in this sort of phase is really just the window frames, and you'll kind of see my leftover geometry here a little bit. I'll turn this off. Right, so these are actually pretty much identical. They're kind of flipped horizontally, but all around they were essentially the same dimension throughout. Okay, so that's what you can kind of or should be trying to shoot for. But to kind of get here, I'll show you kind of my process. There are actually probably like a bunch of different ways to do this, but if you're kind of having something that's like free floating like this, sometimes it's kind of hard to get to things, right? So it's actually just very simple using the polyline and like I know that my corners here are orthogonal and they match. Whoops. So I am actually just snapping to these corners that I know are specifically are flat and planar. You can kind of check them as well. I'm going to turn my near, snap off, right? It's just kind of, it's important to try to make sure that they're not like slightly off, right? Otherwise you'll have trouble extruding it further down the line, okay? And I just moved it kind of out and over, right? I'll kind of tend to do this, right? If you're more comfortable, you can always, kind of find it in a different view, so the front view, and just like be able to do it more in a 2D format, right? And actually, I just like to use the midpoint snaps. So the midpoint snaps to start to kind of subdivide it. I think I roughly eyeballed this one. The near snap is helpful when you're trying to kind of stay on a line, right? But you can always just draw it, get the perpendicular kind of snap, and then just sort of like move it around until it looks, close, or just measure it off of the elevation drawings if you want. Okay, but this is just going to get the subdivisions. You'll notice that there's one operable window where the thickness of the frame is slightly larger, right? So what I do here is actually I just use the rectangle command, right? 1, 2, and just kind of trace over each section again, right? And using the offset command with a distance, I think these skinny ones I did 0.1. So picking the right square, right? So you can do these sort of smaller ones just by like that, okay? And then this one still has a split down the middle, so midpoint to here, right? And then again, using the rectangle to kind of trace it, right? So I'll have a closed curve, offset again. This one is 0.15, 0.1, but then this one, the operable one, I changed the distance to 0.15, so it's slightly thicker. Just make sure you click on the inside and not the outside, okay? So at this point, you should be left with essentially the same thing. And then what I do is actually I select all the inner curves, 2, 3, 4, 4, okay? And the outer one, the big outer one, right? So these are the ones, right, that when you extrude, and I give it a thickness like 0.2, for example, right, then it should be kind of one large frame like this. All right. Shortcut really quickly while you're at it, while this stuff is still here, obviously, it's a good idea to go back to the front, right, and kind of do your glass, right? And so, you know, do another rectangle that goes from here to here, right? If it's the same pane, then there's no kind of point, you know, doing separate ones if you unless you really want to. Just extrude that, and then do something smaller, so 0.1, right? Stick it on a glass layer. Stick this stuff on a frame layer. Right, they disappear because I had it hidden, but then, right, and then you can kind of align them. Now, one of the tricks I use for aligning these is actually I'll zoom into the corner, right, and use the move command and basically snap the midpoint to the midpoint of the frame. So midpoint, you'll see like, you know, there's a midpoint here, so midpoint to midpoint. And essentially it sandwiches the sort of glass inside the frame pretty well. All right, so you just have to kind of like give it the right dimensions. So once you have this, move it back, right, copy it or flip it, you know, mirror it vertically, copy it around, that sort of stuff. Okay. Now, if you don't know how to do this mirror, so mirror has actually a 3-point option. So I can actually say, okay, well, we're going to start here, go that way, and as long as I'm kind of pulling horizontally, basically, so the mirror plane is a horizontal plane. You'll see like here, for example, then it will basically give me the mirror of it in the opposite direction. I can use that and populate it. Okay, so that covers essentially these window frames. And that's probably kind of where we are for this stage. Okay, so this phase you'll see that it's mostly kind of like I pop these in, right? So these kind of parts and as well as the roof, right? So the only thing that's kind of tricky about this, and you'll see that I essentially kind of use this in the plan, right? And I kind of aligned the sort of I-beam profiles in roughly the right place, although it will still need adjustment because you want these to line up perfectly. I just kind of drew the angle, right, as it is here, right? I actually went over here and measured the distance of the kind of length of the roof, something like 32, okay? And I just kind of took that line, extruded it 32. So that's the right dimension and the slant angle for the roof, right? I actually did this twice because I also wanted to do a offset surface. So offset the surface, you know, did 0.3 as the offset distance. I flipped the direction that way just to kind of give it a thickness, right? The one thing you'll notice, and this is probably slightly different, but the one thing you'll notice in the photos is that it kind of has this sort of thicker, you know, bottom part that's a wooden roof, and then has a slightly larger overlapping metal roof with an edge. Okay, so that's why I did this way, like it's sort of double layer. But I think that's something you can kind of do fairly easily this way, right? And just do a slightly larger one, right? And then just take this. One thing that's helpful is actually kind of set up the relationship down here first, right? So I know that, for example, this line here, actually let me change to a color that you can see. This line here, right, is basically kind of this line up here, right, the top of the flange right there, right. So it's helpful to set up that relationship first, right, and actually, so that's why I know that I'm going to kind of take these guys, take the sort of I-beam profiles, which are actually locked right now, so I'm locking them. Take these guys, right, sort of extrude them as well. I actually did measure these beforehand, but instead of doing a full 32, if you kind of look at the photos, they're slightly short of them, right? So I did, I think, 31, and then I just took them and moved them up by 0.5. So they're centered on the plane as well, but they're slightly short on either edge, right? Okay. So these are there. And this is kind of what I use to set this up, using that, to get this distance correct, using this to get this edge correct as well. And actually this has to, sorry, this line should actually extend. So I'm going to extend it further. Okay. So get this, yeah, okay. So this is actually what you should have, or what you want to have set up, because when you basically start moving this into place, let's say like this, right, then this curve will actually give you something to snap to, right, because then I would know exactly that I'm trying to, this is a little bit wonky, but I'm trying to snap it to the top of the flange right there, right, and then I would know at least like vertically, right, it is in the right location. Let me group that so it doesn't mess things up. Okay, and then the next thing is actually to say, well, is it the right location in this direction, right? So easy way to do that is actually just kind of zoom in really close to this. You can do it in the top view if you want. What I do is actually just draw that straight line, right? Extrude it up like that, like a very big plane. Take this, copy it over to that side, right? So you know that, okay, that's pretty close, right, to bracketing it. And so you can then use this as a visual guide to kind of basically get your sort of roof geometry in place. And you'll be able to kind of see, oh, how much does it poke out? Or if you go to the top view as well, right, the top view will actually kind of give you a pretty good handle over that as well. So you just match it, right? Once that's done, then you can delete all this stuff, right? That kind of roof geometry is pretty much in place, right? Now, as I mentioned before, when you kind of do this on the ground over here, right, these locations may not match perfectly with everything, and you'll see this in this case. I had to do a bit of adjusting as well, right? So the red, kind of I-beams were slightly off, right? And so you just have to kind of move them in, right? Now, these are square corner posts, right? And actually, I just put them in, I think dimension-wise, they're 0.6 by 0.6, right, feet. And same thing, I just extended them beyond the roof, and I used the roof to trim it off, right? So previously they were actually just like sticking out. And same way we kind of use the floor slab to kind of trim parts of the stair, poking out parts of the stair off. You can use geometry here to trim as well. So like, for example, this top surface, right, TR trim, that's my shortcut to trim this, right, and it just trims it off. Now, I actually usually do a second trim, so I'm gonna hide this geometry really quickly. because sometimes when you trim like this and when you go to render it, you'll kind of see the edge of stuff and you kind of poking out because it's like technically on the surface there. So to kind of reduce the possibility for any sort of artifacts that may happen, what I do is actually I will go into ghosted mode and then do the trim again, basically kind of taking it down. So even it was this again and trimming, I will click it again so it goes below the surface and not like coplanar with it, right? So I mean, if you're using the wood layer, then you can kind of trim it down so where it's accurate like that. Okay, it's just something that happens when we're going to real kind of proper renderings. That's sort of an issue. Okay, so do that at the corners, midpoints here, right? That'll set this sort of thing up. Same process for these windows. This slanted window, same. What I do is actually just kind of take this and just kind of trace essentially very precisely outer opening, get to the right corners, C to close it, right? And you'll get the sort of closed curve, right? That I move out and do the same thing. So you see those two curves, right? Same thing we did with the window frames. Okay, so that stuff is all pretty straightforward. One trick I do use, and so I will hide this. So I said earlier, for example, like sometimes you might have a situation where like things are off like this and you're trying to align this, right? Which can be kind of annoying to do. Let me close this off, right? Which can be annoying because let's say, I want to match these perfectly, but let's say I'm trying to move it. Well, there's nothing really for me to snap to properly, right? And, how do I know that like this edge intersection point is really getting near to that edge, right? There's no easy way to align it, right? So this is how I do it. So in this case, for example, I want to move this face to here. You select these guys, you run an intersect, which will give you their kind of joint intersection, right? But what it really gives me is a curve point to snap to. So when I move, I can then use that sort of curve point, right? And then using my object tracks, it will actually snap to the perpendicular point on that face or that surface, right? So that's actually how I very quickly am able to align these things so they actually, work are coplanar. Okay, so that's just a quick trick I've learned to be able to align things like these properly, right? And so this is the basic setup. These are centered, and just kind of get all that stuff in place. So, right, so that by that point you should have most of this, sort of in place. You see the sort of red ones from earlier, just kind of align things so they make sense. All of these sort of windows frames are pushed back a tiny little bit, so they get a little bit of like indent, right? That sort of stuff, right? So it gives you an idea of what this phase is. Okay. Almost done. So phase 5 is kind of the trickier, sometimes tricky one. It's really these stairs, kind of annoying to deal with. And I'll kind of show you the framework that I have for that. Everything else here is pretty much done, right? It's actually just this. Now, there are two things here. One is that, as you can kind of see in some of the photos, these are obviously kind of open mesh wire kind of balustrades, right? So there's two things you have to do. You have to do the railings themselves, which is easy, but then the mesh. I actually typically wouldn't model these things, right? This open mesh, just because unless you're doing these for diagrams, then you can just do like simple curves and just like, export the line work. But if you actually model them and pipe them, like the geometry gets really heavy when you have things that are like dense like this, or even the sort of like open steel kind of floor sort of things on the decks and the balconies, because if you try to model it, right, it's doable, but it will bog down your model a lot. Okay, so this type of thing is the type of thing I typically would treat just as a material on when we get to a rendering engine. Okay, so that's why they're actually just modeled as surfaces here. this and this, right? These eventually we can just like apply a material to it, and it will give you that sort of open wire mesh kind of feeling. Okay, so but at the same time, I think these pipes, right? Essentially, what I do is I find the center line of this, I trace it, copy it up, and just like draw these. These are 3 feet in height, sort of balustrades, right? And this sort of curve network, I just pipe them, right? So give you kind of an idea of how that works. Just using the polyline, right? So oftentimes these will actually kind of give you something that you can kind of snap to, especially at these sort of corner joints. So this just makes sure, this kind of guarantees that it's at the center. Let me turn off my mirror because it's freaking out. So that's right. And you can kind of go here. What I would say is like don't go all the way to the end, because then your pipe will be kind of half embedded in the wall, but just like pull it slightly short and just find a dimension that makes sense. So like here, maybe it's 9.4, right? So there's a little bit of room there between the ends, okay? And then you can complete the other edge. I think I already had a curve that was already there. So, just sort of join these, right? Copy vertical, click anywhere, pull it up in just 3, right? So that's 3 feet in between them, okay? And then just draw one of the sort of first vertical corners or posts, and copy this midpoint, endpoint, should be somewhere here. Okay, midpoint, right, corner. This one in particular actually has 2 spread out, not in the middle. So quick way I'll do that is just redraw that line. Take the line itself, divide it by 3. So I get those points, copy those over, boom, boom. Okay, so we should have pretty much everything, right? So select all the posts and the top rail. This is a good point to group them together. Run the pipe command. This for the radius 0.075, I think, is what I was using. Maybe. Let me see. Yeah, sounds about right. But you can kind of adjust it, right? Just like that's kind of what I used. So we get these sort of larger tubes, steel tubes. And a trick I'll use a lot is also just like to select last created objects like this, so I can group them together, right? Make selection more easy, and then just move them onto the pipe layer, right? So that's what these should look like. And the process for this is basically the same, okay? The way I get these actually is just as the same simple sort of technique of just like taking that sort of profile that's on the ground, this curve, and just extruding it something like 2.2, right, to get that. And then you just kind of move it into place. Obviously, you should standardize this sort of dimension. I think I did 2.4 or something, right? So the top gap and the bottom gap are consistent in all of these, right? So just make sure you're moving these, let's say 0.3, not too low. So maybe like 0.7, too high. So, okay, 0.6, something like that, okay? So you can turn on the pipes back to look like, okay, does that look correct, right? So that's how I get the sort of wire mesh sort of balustrades. Okay, all right, almost done. These are pretty much the same thing. I mean, there's a couple of fancier things here, but it's just, kind of, let me show you the lines, right? So if you can kind of get the tops, same thing, kind of trace the center line of this, copy it up 3, and then you can start there and just get if you have your perpendicular snap on, right, then you can just like get a perpendicular one. I mean, this is pretty close, right? Same thing we're doing with the stairs, okay? So the only like tricky thing here is really this thing, okay? And I will kind of show you, right? So you'll see my kind of geometry in here with the stairs turned off. So I have a couple things here. Initially, it was actually just a trace off of this, right? So kind of going to one of the top views, what I did was actually just use the sort of Polyline sort of command, and I just started here, did this, trace, and I mean, I think there are kind of ways to be more precise about this, but this is sort of quick and dirty, and just end it somewhere there, right? Okay. And then I went to the other one, which is this one that turns the corner, right? So it's essentially the extension of that. So started sort of here, went there, and up, right? And I know that actually just is the balcony, right? So we're just trying to kind of get it to connect to the balcony, right? And once that's done, I try to assemble these. So this guy here and this guy here, right? This one has to be turned this way 90 degrees. This one turned this way 90 degrees. This move, snap it to the end, and basically kind of gets you that corner, join it, gets you that corner profile, right? Then I take this and I just move it essentially to the end edge of the steel. Let me get closer. Right, there's a lot of stuff right now, but essentially I'm snapping it to, well, actually the bottom edge should be the bottom edge right here of the balcony, right, which we had, okay? And it gives you the profile. So same thing as before when we did the sort of edge beams here, right? There is I basically kind of placed the steel profile here. Let me pull it out so you can see it. So there's this curve. Change that to that layer so you can see it, okay? So essentially this curve running along that with a sweep command, okay? So what I'll do is sweep one, select rail, select profile, enter, right? And you should, if you did it correctly, get something pretty close, right? All right. Depending on what you did here, like yours might dive down below and above, but honestly, I think in their photo as well, it's actually also something a little bit like that, right? So it's a bit of a stub at the end. So we're not gonna necessarily obsess about that detail, but you should be able to get that edge, all right? Now the inner one actually gets a little bit trickier because you can kind of take this curve and offset it inwards by the correct amount, but something kind of funky happens in these sort of inner corners. So honestly, what I ended up kind of like doing is actually just like splitting these two parts, essentially like basically taking this whole thing apart, so you can actually just say copy this to the side, right? There's something funny happening there, right? This thing exploding it, right? And I know that like this segment here pretty much is it's mirrored on the other side, and then the other segment is on the other side, so I just join these again, right? And you can mirror this sort of in plan, right? So you get it's like opposite on this side, essentially, right? These guys on the bottom, including this whole segment here, this segment and this, join it. And then I mirror it the other way, all right? So we get it on that side as well. So same thing. Oops, actually should have done it together. So all this mirror like that, right? So Just make sure it's a good thing to kind of either join them and group them so they're easy to select together, right? And then just know that like actually this is probably a crossing, which you'll eventually kind of see in the images that they're supposed to do this, right? Because there's also a support under here, right? And it'll give you the two sides a bit more accurately, right? So this can be snapped, but you know, let's see. You'll have to kind of find the right corner points like that. Okay, so this is actually probably the easiest way to do that. My version was actually a little bit more wonky and went through some other stuff, right? But once you have those two kind of lines in place, then you can use this, right? Same thing, same trick we did with the stairs below before, right? Subdivide them to kind of get all the treads through. You'll notice actually like in some cases like some of the treads will actually be part of a larger, you know, platform, right? So or like I think this end tread is part of this as well, right? So just kind of, you know, work with that and go along as you know, figure it out as you go. Actually, this one is incorrect because this one should be up there and this tread should be down there. So just a note. So I'm actually going to see if I can fix that right now. So this should go here. And this can kind of slide back, essentially. Like that's what that should look like. All right. So once you're done with that, I think that's actually pretty much it. Like this is probably going to be the trickiest part. There's a sort of support beam down here, two extra kind of posts. If you kind of look at the photos, you'll see that. But it gets us pretty close. I think in this version, we don't see it yet, but there's essentially just like the final sliding walls that have to go around here, but that's pretty much it. So I'll close this. This is the final. So I just added these walls with some thickness, but these are meant to be the sort of sliding walls that go on the outside. There's some sort of pulley hanger rail here, but we don't really see it. So, you know, let's just like kind of not bother with that. But this is what it should generally get close to looking like. All right, there's more details and more things we can fix. Note that this balustrade ends early, so access to the storage room is there. This is just a door kind of molded in there. This is, you know, a simple volume with a sort of door cutout. Can add more detail to the interiors, but if you can get to this sort of point in time, then or this sort of detail, then you're pretty good. All right. One thing I did add was a big circle, just to kind of give it a horizon line and a ground plane. It's on its own locked sort of layer. Do kind of try to sort things through in terms of layers and name them properly. So the pipes, wire mesh, stairs exterior, right? That's what I'm using for these colors. So things are kind of just like easy to recognize. I do still have the images in here, right? They're kind of there. Just close them and lock them so I don't click on them all the time by accident unless I really am going to move them around. And then the sort of default layers where I have a lot of my older geometries, because you never know when you need them. You know, it's easier just to keep them around just in case. All right. So what the big circle does is like gives the shadows something to cast on, and especially in the rendered mode. I did assign a simple glass material to the glass. So just come here, right, in the material, give it a sort of material. Actually, if you do a new one, right, you can pick glass from here, right? Essentially, that's what I did. And then give it a little bit of like, you know, opacity so that in the render view, it will look more like that. So you can kind of get a better sense of what's clear and what's not. And that's it. All right. So give that a shot. There are always kind of smaller things inside the interiors you can kind of get to if you want to. But I think the point of this exercise is just to kind of have you take a stab at modeling something from scratch, sort of more on your own without, step-by-step hand-holding and kind of work through some of those issues. But I think I've shown you most of the kind of, trickier or like quicker things I tend to do with things like this. All right.